Amstetten is a quiet town in Austria. The kind of place where neighbors know each other by name, where kids ride bikes on tree-lined streets, and where nothing particularly remarkable ever happens. It sits between Vienna and Salzburg, unremarkable, unhurried. The kind of town you pass through without giving it a second thought. Josef Fritzl lived there for decades. He was known to the locals. He had a house, a family, a reputation for being strict, competent, orderly. He rented out apartments in his building. He fixed things. He showed up when he said he would. He was, by every outward measure, a normal man. But beneath his house, sealed behind a reinforced concrete wall, was another world entirely. And that world had been locked shut since August 28, 1984. It started, as these things often do, with a lie. His daughter, Elizabeth, had supposedly run away from home at the age of 18. That was the story Josef told to his wife, to neighbors, to authorities. Young people do this sometimes. They get restless. They leave. Nobody thought too hard about it. But Elizabeth hadn't run away. What happened in those early days of August 1984 is something investigators would spend years trying to piece together. What is known is this. Josef Fritzl had been expanding and reinforcing a section of his basement for months. He had constructed a hidden door behind a heavy shelving unit. The entrance was concealed so thoroughly that even people who had been in that basement countless times never suspected what was behind it. The door required an electronic key to open from the outside. From the inside, there was no handle at all. Once you were inside, you were inside. The space itself was not large. The initial chamber was barely big enough to stand in. Over time, Josef would expand it in sections, digging out, reinforcing, adding crude rooms one by one over the years, until the underground complex reached several connected spaces. But even at its largest, it was a cramped, airless, suffocating place. There were no windows. The only light came from electric bulbs that flickered at his choosing. The ventilation was primitive. In summer, the heat was unbearable. In winter, the cold came up through the concrete floors. Elizabeth lived there for 24 years. She gave birth 7 times in that basement. 3 of the children were eventually brought upstairs and allowed to live in the house above, where Josef maintained the fiction that they had been abandoned on his doorstep. The others never left the underground at all. Some of those children grew up never having seen sunlight, never having felt rain, never having stood in an open space large enough to run. The world above continued as it always had. Josef went to work. He had dinner with his wife. He hosted barbecues. He was photographed at holiday celebrations, smiling in the way that normal people smile. Neighbors waved to him from across the street. Nobody knew. Not his wife, not the children upstairs, not the investigators who had occasionally looked into Elizabeth's disappearance over the years. Nobody. For 24 years, that was how things stood. What finally broke it open was not a slip, not a careless mistake. It was a medical emergency. In April of 2008, one of the children born in the basement, a young woman by then, 19 years old, collapsed and was taken to hospital. Her condition was serious. The doctors treating her were confused by what they were seeing. She had no medical records, no history. In every clinical sense, she was a person who had appeared from nowhere. Josef Fritzl, under pressure he may not have anticipated, brought Elizabeth upstairs for the first time in 2.5 decades. She was permitted to go to the hospital to be with her daughter. And that was where everything ended. A nurse who had been following news reports about the sick girl recognized something in Elizabeth's manner, in the careful, fearful way she moved through the hospital. The nurse alerted police. Officers spoke with Elizabeth. At first, she said nothing. She had been conditioned over decades to protect the secret, to understand what disclosure would mean. But eventually, she began to talk. When investigators reached the house on Ibstrasse, they found the hidden door behind the shelving. They found the tunnels. They found the rooms. The children who had spent their entire lives underground were brought out on April 26, 2008. Some of them had to shield their eyes from ordinary daylight. The case sent a shockwave through Austria and then through the rest of the world. How had this happened for so long without detection? How had no one known? The answers, when they came, were deeply uncomfortable. They pointed to the particular terror of a controlled environment, a man who had spent years carefully managing every piece of information that left his household, who had constructed a narrative so consistent and maintained it so completely that even the people closest to him had no reason to look harder. The scariest part of the Fritzl case was never the physical construction of that basement. It was the ordinary life that sat directly above it. It was the fact that evil of this magnitude can coexist for decades with normalcy. It can live in a tidy house, on a quiet street, in a peaceful town. It can attend neighborhood events and nod hello to the postman. It can look like nothing at all from the outside. Josef Fritzl was convicted in 2009. He pleaded guilty to all charges, including murder by negligence for the death of one of the infants born in the basement, who did not survive. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and ordered to a secure psychiatric facility. Elisabeth and her surviving children were given new identities and relocated. Their current whereabouts remain protected. The house on Ibstrasse was eventually demolished. The basement was sealed and filled. But the questions that case raised don't go away that easily. They stay with you. Because somewhere in the back of your mind, once you've heard this story, you start to understand something that most people never want to think about. The door doesn't always look like a door. Sometimes it looks like a wall. Sometimes it looks like shelving you've walked past 100 times without a second thought. And sometimes the most dangerous rooms are the ones hidden in plain sight, right beneath the house of someone who, to all the world, looks perfectly, unremarkably normal. Strasshof an der Nordbahn is the kind of suburb that exists in every country. Unremarkable streets, modest houses set back from the pavement, small gardens, two-car driveways. The kind of place where people move to raise children, where retired couples tend their yards on Sunday mornings, where nothing much ever happens. Wolfgang Priklopil lived there for years. He was quiet. He paid his bills. He drove a white minivan and kept to himself. Neighbors remembered him as polite, maybe a little reclusive, but not in any way that made you look twice. He had been a communications technician. He owned his house outright. He was the sort of man you might pass on the street 100 times without registering his face. Beneath his garage, he had been building something. He had started the construction years before it was needed, digging out a chamber underneath the garage floor, reinforcing the walls, soundproofing every surface. He installed a heavy steel and concrete door that locked from the outside. He ran in a ventilation pipe, barely adequate, and a single electric light. When he was done, the room measured roughly 5 square meters. You could take 3 steps in one direction before hitting a wall. That was where Natascha Kampusch spent the next 8 years of her life. She was 10 years old when he took her. It was the morning of March 2nd, 1998, a Monday. She had argued with her mother before leaving the house. One of those small, ordinary domestic arguments that children and parents have constantly, the kind you expect to forget about by dinner. She left for school at around 7 in the morning. The walk was short. She never arrived. Witnesses later described seeing a young girl being pulled into a white minivan near her home. Some had reported it at the time. The description of the vehicle was logged, but the lead went nowhere, and in the weeks and months that followed, the investigation widened and then, slowly, painfully, narrowed to nothing. Her parents were investigated. Theories multiplied. The case drew significant media attention in Austria, then faded, as these cases eventually do when answers refuse to come. Meanwhile, underneath a garage in Strasshof, a child sat in a room smaller than most people's bathrooms and waited for the sound of the door. The details that emerged after her escape are the kind that stay with you long after you've heard them. The room had no windows. Natural light was something she experienced only when Fritzl decided to allow it. On the rare occasions he brought her upstairs into the house, always under strict observation, always with the understanding of what would happen if she tried anything. He controlled every variable of her existence. What she ate, when she slept, when she was permitted to speak. He monitored the news obsessively. He had constructed the room specifically so that no sound could penetrate it from outside, and no sound from inside could reach the street. People walked past that house every day. They wheeled bins out to the curb. They walked dogs. They reversed out of their driveways and headed to work. A school bus route ran nearby. None of it reached her. What investigators and psychologists would later describe about her captivity was the particular cruelty of total environmental control. Over time, Fritzl became the only consistent thing in her world. He was the source of food, of human contact, of any variation in her daily existence. The psychological mechanisms this produces have been studied extensively in the years since her case came to light. What researchers sometimes refer to as traumatic bonding. The survival adaptation that occurs when captivity is absolute and prolonged. It is not weakness. It is the mind doing what minds do when the alternative is something too large to sustain. She later described the silence as one of the hardest things. Not the darkness, not the physical confinement, but the silence. The complete absence of any sound that wasn't controlled by him. The distant, unreachable quality of the world above her. She was held from the age of 10 to the age of 18. The escape, when it finally came, was not dramatic in the way that escapes in films tend to be. It was ordinary, almost to the point of being mundane, which somehow makes it more remarkable. On August 23, 2006, Fritzl was distracted by a phone call in the garden. Natascha was nearby, working. She simply walked away, down the street, away from the house, until she reached a neighbor who let her inside and called the police. She was 18 years old. She had been missing for 3,096 days. When officers arrived at the house and began their search, the hidden entrance to the cellar was not immediately obvious. It took time to locate. The door was concealed, the construction deliberate. Everything about the room had been designed to be invisible, to exist without leaving any trace in the ordinary life of the house above it. Fritzl, upon learning she had escaped, died later that same day. He stepped in front of a train. He left no explanation. The case reshaped how Austrian authorities and law enforcement agencies across Europe handled missing children reports. The specific details of the Strasshof investigation, the early lead on the white minivan that was followed and then dropped, became a case study in what happens when initial information is not pursued with sufficient urgency. Changes to protocol followed. They were too late for Natascha Kampusch, but they were made. She has spoken publicly since her escape. She has written about her experiences. She has, by any observable measure, refused to disappear again, this time on her own terms. Her openness about what happened to her has been described by some commentators as difficult to comprehend, and by others as the most coherent possible response to what she survived. She has said she does not want her captor to define her life. She has also said in various interviews that the years in that room did not take everything from her, that she read, that she thought, that she kept some interior life intact through sheer insistence. The house in Strasshof still stands. The room beneath the garage is still there. There are streets like that one in every country. Quiet, unremarkable, forgettable. Houses with ordinary facades and ordinary gardens. Neighbors who wave and ask about the weather. Most of those houses contain exactly what they appear to contain. But this case, and the handful of others like it that have come to light over the past several decades, have a way of sitting in the back of the mind long after you've finished reading about them. Because the thing that makes them so difficult to process isn't the horror of what was done. It's the geography of it. It's the distance, measured in meters, in a few feet of concrete and insulation and a locked steel door, between a child held in darkness and a street full of people going about their ordinary lives. 3,096 days, and the world walked right past.